talk a little bit about the forward walking stance, or Seisan Dachi, whatever you want to call it. Dachi just means stance. This is called Seisan Dachi because it is the dominant stance found in our Seisan Kata. It's a stance that every beginner is forced to learn, and you'll walk up and down the floor with it, forwards and backwards. But there's a lot more to it than just being a forward stance. First of all, stances are not static. Stances are fluid. You see a boxer, he has a stance. Different kind of interpretation of the word stance. In karate, stance is a transitional position. It would be like I'm walking. This would be one stance, this would be another stance, this would be another stance, and this would be another stance. When we teach these stances, they're very, very technical. And you have to demonstrate them very technically within your kata. What we're really doing is we're developing what we call a body-mind connection. So when I say to go to Seisan Dachi, right leg back, she drops into Seisan Dachi, right leg back. Doesn't have to think about it, just happens. When you're fighting, if you need to be in a Seisan on the oblique, you will need to be able to drop immediately into that technique. We do that by reinforcing this technique over and over and over again. Now, we're going to start with ready stance. The Seisan Dachi, the Seisan stance, or forward walking stance, starts simply by moving a half moon out. Boom. The front leg is bent, the back leg is bent. In some systems, they use Zenkutsu Dachi, which means the back leg is all but locked. But we're going to talk about that in reference to a forward walking stance here in a second. The reason the legs are bent is so if I kick, and they're bent, they give. If they're locked, so she locks, goes to Zenkutsu Dachi, if she's locked, I can kick and hyperextend one of the knees. When we do our forward walking stance, we start from Yoi position, or ready position. She steps out, that's one step, hands go up. When she finally gets to Zenkutsu Dachi, it's the culmination of the entire step. Yoi, forward walking stance, Zenkutsu Dachi are all one movement. And the reason we have that movement is the way we generate power is through hip rotation, shoulder rotation, and weight transfer. Little weight transfer, total weight transfer. All weight goes from the back to the front. That's why we do a forward walking stance. Okinawan karate, face the camera, our hips are more square in our forward walking stance. And the Japanese karate, their hips are on more of a diagonal. Some Okinawan systems, the hips are slightly on a diagonal. The reason that we have our hips in a more hip squared position is so we can bring all four weapons to bear. Boom, 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 boom. If our hips are rotated and they're back farther, then we have to correct and bring the technique through. Even if we step, we have to correct and bring the technique through. And it takes longer. The longer you give your opponent to see a technique, the easier it is for him to stop it. Now, the Japanese aren't wrong, the Japanese aren't right, they just do it differently. I'm not saying we're absolutely correct, but this is how we do it. The other thing is we do half moons, demonstration of half moons. The half moon has a couple of things. One, it's a technique. You're fighting, I slip around, it's Soto Otoshi. Boom, I throw it. The other thing is, I go to the half moon and step, come around, and just drive your knee into her knee. It's a technique. It's not just a move. So we practice this, we practice this, we practice this until we can do it without faith. Our feet are flat. Toes slightly grip the floor. We don't grip the floor so tightly that we arch our feet. We grip the floor tightly and spread out the foot as much as possible to grasp as much ground as possible for obvious reasons. One is there are many, many techniques within the kata that are not just punches and strikes and elbows and knees. They're grappling techniques. In grappling techniques, you want your feet flat, firmly planted. Because if you're up on one foot, you're vulnerable. The strongest technique is when both feet are on the floor. She lifts one foot and balance is compromised. This is why when we do half moons, our half moon never leaves the floor. Because if our foot lifts, the technique is compromised. Last but not least, she's going to do a forward walking stance with a low block so you can see the half moons and the combinations of how combinations come to work together with the stance. We teach the stance first because that's your foundation. Your stance is the foundation of your karate. Weak stances, weak karate. This builds the body-mind connection. Remember that. That's the most important term you'll learn when you're learning classical technique, is you build that body-mind connection because it teaches your mind and your body to work in ways that are non-traditional. You don't just walk down the street like this, but it translates into other things. When you go to learn kicks, throws, and everything else, your mind is will more readily adapt these new concepts than if you just walk like you normally do. So let's do forward walking stance, low block. The other thing is when you're doing these techniques, the body stops, shoulders rotate, hips rotate, and the block all stops at the same time for the hips and the feet stop. That's how you generate maximum power within your blocks and your punches. And that's pretty much the forward walking stance.